Why is a raven like a writing desk?
Oh, I believe I can answer that.
Do you mean you can find the answer to it?
Exactly so.
Then you should say what you mean.
I do. At least I mean what I say. That's the same thing, you know.
No, not the same thing a bit. You might as well say that I see what I eat is the same thing as I eat what I see.
Gilbert, it's rather an odd thing to my mind that people talk about philosophy of mind so much nowadays. There are courses on the subject in university and books written with that title, and yet nobody had ever mentioned it, so far as I know, until about the last 25 years, have they?
Yes, that's an interesting question. I think part of the answer is that it's only fairly recently that we've started talking about the philosophy of so-and-so anyhow, the philosophy of physics, the philosophy of law, and so on. However, I think there's more to it than that. In the 19th century, until fairly late in the 19th century, the word philosophy and philosopher, they were used pretty generally for any sort of an inquirer of a theoretical sort, so that Newton would be called a philosopher just as much as Locke or Berkeley. And then, later on, when what we now call psychology was developing, it too was called philosophy, and the philosophers were supposed to be the people to research in it and teach it. And then, in the 20th century, when the psychologists began to hive off and have departments of their own, there were still a number of philosophical questions which had been discussed before, which were now given, so to speak, an examination title of their own. So one then would have an examination paper, maybe in the philosophy of mind, and a book by Ryle, perhaps, would be used in this. But this is rather a new thing to speak of the philosophy of so-and-so as if philosophy divided into branches in the same way as the way in which, say, chemistry divides into branches.
Take some more tea.
I've had nothing yet, so I can't take more.
Oh, you mean you can't take less? It's very easy to take more than nothing.
I came up to Oxford as a freshman in 1919, and that was 52 years ago. This was the Queen's College, where I spent 5 happy years, during which I rose to the giddy height of captain of boats. Apart from 4 bloodless years in khaki during the Second World War, my career has been the uninterruptedly scholastic one of an Oxford undergraduate, an Oxford graduate, an Oxford college tutor, an Oxford proctor, and an Oxford University professor. The epithets cloistered, unworldly, and stuffy would suggest themselves to any journalist. Even my mere quarter-century of editing a professional journal would hardly qualify as participation in the rough and tumble of real life.
I was born in 1915. My father was a Methodist minister, which meant that he had to move around from place to place every 3 or 4 years. But I was sent away to school at Bath, and from there I came to Oxford as an undergraduate at Corpus Christi College, where actually I am again now. And then the war broke out, and I spent 5 years, I suppose, or 6 years in the army, and was in Germany for years, a prisoner of war. Spent my time there playing bridge and doing mathematics. I went to Scotland as a professor at the University of St Andrews, but I came back to Oxford, I suppose, to my own original college. Otherwise I don't suppose I would in fact have come back to Oxford. I think I would have stayed away.
Do you think it's a general rule that most dons in Oxford were undergraduates in Oxford as well?
In most of the art subjects, it still is true that the vast majority were undergraduates at Oxford. It isn't altogether easy to avoid. For example, The philosophy I have to teach includes teaching modern philosophy, and it includes teaching some of the works of Plato and Aristotle with the original Greek. And there just aren't many people who weren't educated in Oxford themselves who actually can combine these two.
I suspect that the ways in which my mind has moved were powerfully influenced by the fact that I was one of 10 children, of whom not only my brothers, but also my sisters, had interests and vocations differing interestingly from each other and from my own. Get on to this one. Oh, that was not tall enough. Oh, yes, he is. You can get it. I'm glad to say that I was not allowed in the home to puff out my chest for being a would-be philosopher. Rather, I was from the start kept on the offensive-defensive on behalf of my peculiar hobby. During the 1920s, when I had begun to teach at Christ Church, philosophy in the English-speaking world, including Oxford, but not including Cambridge, was still in a very tepid condition. We had the impression that they were still dragging on a Victorian, Edwardian election campaign between one thing called idealism and another thing called realism. What this election issue was all about was made difficult to discover by the fact that the spokesmen of the opposing sides never seemed actually to confront one another. I remember thinking that it would be rather hard to convince my sceptical brothers that my peculiar subject of philosophy could matter very much if it amounted only to championship of realism, or else, alternatively, championship of idealism. They would have said, why not just stop bothering about both isms? And this we pretty soon did. We had to. For real philosophical crises were partly imminent and partly already on us. But to say what these crises were would be to tell the philosophical history of our half-century. I was lucky enough to belong successively to 3 great colleges, to Queen's as an undergraduate, to Christ Church as tutor, and also as student, which is what they call fellows, and to Magdalen as professor. I have now retired and live 6 miles out of Oxford at Islip, but I retain connections with all 3 colleges. After my rather pseudo-military career in the Second World War, I came back to Oxford in 1945, now as Professor of Philosophy. This professorial chair makes its holder a Fellow of Magdalen. Since 1945, I have committed 3 rare books, namely The Concept of Mind, Dilemmas, and Plato's Progress, and a collection of essays, reviews, etc. by myself, which date from my very early to my very late days as a teacher of philosophy.
Hello, Gilbert.
Oh, hello, Jim. Glad to see you.
Hard at work or relaxing?
Not working very hard. Let me just get to the end of this little stretch, and then we can go and sit, and I can feel that I've done my day's work.
If it's work.
If it's work. Anyhow, compared to some other things, it's a treat rather than a pain.
They're very sharp. They're cutting well.
Yes. Been a long tradition, as you know, Jim, by which what's mental has to be classified either as having to do with thought and knowledge, cognitive as they call it, or with how a person acts, his willing and his choosing and his deciding and so on, and thirdly, with his emotions. And a very crude way of putting this would be to say that a mind is divided into 3 bits: thought, feeling, and willing or acting. However, even behind this there's an interesting difference, that on the whole, when the Greek philosophers were talking about feelings, emotions, etc., they were pretty scathing about them. And I spoke as if the fewer feelings and emotions a chap had, the better. Whereas nowadays, I think the tendency is we rather preen ourselves, in theory anyhow, as if a chap had a peculiar depth and profundity in him if he's got a lot of emotions and strong ones, and if he hasn't.
Yeah.
How would you account for this? What is the reason?
Well, I'm sure if you ask me that question, it must be because you do know the answer, but I'll have a shot at giving an answer all the same. A part of the answer, I should think, was that the ancients, those the ancients you're thinking of, had the notion of an emotion as a kind of disturbance, which would therefore be an interference. So that supposing that you had a feeling of pleasure as you were talking to me, that this pleasure would get in the way of your conversation, and so you would be likely to talk less sensibly, less accurately to me, because you had this feeling which was in the way, and that therefore the ideal would be an absence of feeling, which was always a distraction from the more important things, which were the thinkings and the sayings and doings.
A creature that couldn't think any thoughts of any sort, like maybe a rabbit, he couldn't feel indignance.
Though he could feel pain.
He could feel pain, he could feel fear, maybe he could feel anger of a sort, namely if another rabbit was going off with his wife or something of the sort. But indignation, we'd want to say, can only be felt by a creature that can think thoughts of a certain sort.
That's true. But I think another thing which will bring out the difference between indignation and indigestion is that, for example, the thing is what is the cause of my indignation may not have occurred at all. I mean, I may be indignant with you for having written a lampoon on me,
yes,
when in fact you haven't written a lampoon on me, and yet that's the cause of my indignation.
Yes.
Whereas the cause of my indigestion couldn't possibly be some food that I hadn't eaten.
No.
And I think this shows that...
Yes, let's say a false belief or opinion can be quite sufficient for you to have certain sorts of feelings, and it couldn't be anything like sufficient for you to have certain other sorts.
Yeah.
Well, then this makes it look, and this is again to tie up the question of some feelings with the thoughts that we think, as if some feelings are not only peculiar to what our old-fashionedly call rational animals, but so to speak, it's rational of that creature to feel those feelings. Now, would you say that the question whether a person is in a certain mood or not makes a difference to our estimate of, I'll call it, use the old-fashioned word, his rationality? Would we say that it's silly for a person to be or to let himself be in such and such a mood, but shrewd or sensible or wise or something like that?
No.
In other cases?
I don't think so, no.
Doesn't seem to me to fit.
No. But then...
I think if a person happens to be in a cheerful mood and is then asked for his opinion about some important matter, like, say, the Vietnam War, and because he's in a cheerful and frivolous mood, he gives a verdict such as, it's about as important as bank holiday or something like that, then we'd certainly condemn him for coming to this verdict simply because he was in this frivolous mood. And conversely, I think if a person was in a somber mood, they're seeing everything in dark grey and black, and he was asked what he thought of the clown's antics in the circus, and he gave an estimate of the clown's antics in serious existentialist terms of a very depressing nature. Again, we say he was an ass. he might be inclined to give this sort of verdict because he's in a somber mood, but this couldn't be the verdict of a sensible person who oughtn't to let this sort of thing affect his verdict. It's letting your judgment be influenced by the fact that you're in a bad temper, which is irrational. But you might be in a good temper, and let's take not a case of an antic, but of a joke. There are unkind, unfeeling jokes, like Emma's against Miss Bates in Jane Austen's novel. There are unkind little jokes which ought indeed to be condemned, as in this case it was by Mr. Knightley, in the severest terms. Although it is only a little joke, it was a brutal little joke, and ought to be treated, so to speak, with a maximum of Sartrean intolerance. Oh, no, not intolerance, disapproval.
Some things, of course, are very much more complex than anything we've yet considered, too, aren't they? I mean, you know, there's these sort of things like, famous cases with things like love, where, well, I mean, how do you know whether you're in love? Well, wait till next year, and then you'll know how you were now.
Yes, yes.
It's impossible to comprehend these things under the traditional old formula of a kind of inner disturbance.
Yes.
I suppose that being a reasonable being, being a person capable of reasoning, perhaps makes you something which is capable of love in this wider sense.
And no one who's in love is going to condemn all his bachelor friends for being so stupid as not to be in love with this girl.
No, this is very distinct from admiration. If you admire somebody, if I don't admire that person, you must think that I'm mistaken.
Yes.
Which is quite different from loving the person.
Yes. I think part of the trouble is that we are, again, rather beginning to talk about emotion or feeling in a sort of umbrella way, as if a mood like frivolity and a particular feeling like amusement came out of the same basket. And with that, the old temptation to which the Greeks succumbed in one way and we tend to succumb in the other, that reason and feeling stand to one another as the housewife and the hot water tap. The housewife has her hand on the tap, and sometimes she turns the hot water on, and sometimes she turns it off. And reason sometimes turns amusement on, and sometimes turns it off. Well, that's nonsense anyhow.
I'm not sure that I would want to say that a reason is against emotion anyway. I mean, supposing that somebody had behaved very badly, and you did not feel dislike, contempt for him, then I think that I would, this would seem to me obvious, I would say there is something wrong with you. Can't you see? Are you not aware how badly he has behaved? I don't think I'm wanting to say at all that emotion has nothing to do with reason, or either that, or that reason should control emotion. What I'm thinking, on the whole, I wanted to say that whereas in things like having pains and so on, reason doesn't come into at all, it seems in things like mood, reason doesn't come into at all. There are some things which we might call emotion. You can't be reasonable. I mean, you can't have these feelings unless you are a reasonable being. Having these sorts of things, like indignation, is something which is essentially part of rational activity. It couldn't be irrational. It couldn't be in a non-rational being at all.
One thing which surprised a good many philosophers of what I vaguely call the English-speaking type were rather taken aback when they found people say like such. He picks on some particular emotion. For example, Heidegger's angst, which I'll vaguely translate as anxiety, or Sartre's favourite one, nausea, and you find this particular emotion being built up into something terribly important, as if everything was really governed, or should be governed, or shouldn't be governed by angst or by nausea.
I think this is true, and what I think you also notice in people who many of these sort of continental type analyses of emotion, is that how dramatic it becomes, namely that these emotions become in fact people. They have opinions and attitudes and views.
Yes.
And in fact, it always seems to me that if you take Sartre and compare his dramatic works with his philosophical works, is that the main difference is that the philosophical works tend to have, the characters tend to have names like l'imagination, rather than Jacques or Jean.
Yes.
But there still are plays in which characters are in dramatic relationships with each other, which is a very ancient mistake to make.
Yes. Well, there are thousands of emotions which every novelist mentions, some of on every page, and he'll mention nausea sometimes, and he'll mention worry about the cosmos sometimes, but he's not going to build any one of them up into a sort of devil behind the scenes, or a god behind the scenes.
Well, what is the philosophy of mind really about? Let me make a suggestion to you as I see it. That seems to me to be two very large problems, which you might say almost were metaphysical. One of them, the famous problem of the relation of mind to body, which isn't about any particular problem of mental life, but it's a very general issue. And I should think another one, which probably arises because the mind somehow seems to be hidden away inside the body, is how we could have not any knowledge of anybody mental goings-on apart from our own. And those seem to me, as it were, to be the two big problems, though of course there are lots of very interesting problems about the nature of memory and the nature of thought and the nature of intention and so on, which would be within the philosophy of mind. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think I'd just add one thing. Certainly in my own memory, some people were interested in what I really call the place of mind when they were considering how it was possible for a person or a person's mind, so to speak, to get out of itself to an external world. All questions of perception, first of all, and then action on things outside as well. This goes with what you were talking about from another angle, namely the notion that a person's mind is really a sort of grotto into which things can't get from outside and out of which things can't get to the outside world.
Yeah, but it seems intentions may be rather a special case, aren't they? Because, as it were, having an intention is something like making up your mind, and obviously, as it were, since you're the person who makes up your mind, as it were, you can say how you've made up your mind. It's rather like a child saying what he's drawing. I mean, that is to say, since he decides what he's drawing, he obviously is somehow specially off. But sometimes, though, you might want to say of some things that, like your temperature, or that we're equally good position to know, and of other things, like, shall we say, as to whether you're clever, perhaps they'd ask me rather than ask you, and if they want to know whether I was vain, they'd ask you rather than ask me.
I'd certainly want to say that there are quite a number of sorts of things, such that the person in a certain condition, or a person with, say, a certain intention, ask him what state he's in or what he intends to do, and of course he can answer straight away without looking around for evidence, probing any secrets or anything. It's his intention, so of course he can tell you what his intention is. On the other hand, of course, there are other things where he's not in a better position than other people. If you ask me what my temperature is at the moment, of course I'm in no stronger position than you are, and both of us are in a weaker position than the hospital nurse who's got the thermometer.
Well then, what is the right way? You written a book a long time ago now, I suppose, on the concept of mind. What would you say was the general answer you would give to this problem of the relation of mind and body and privacy there arising from it?
Yes, I think I would want to say that the book had a leading polemical motive, namely to shoot down this grotto picture of what a mind is. not, as some people wanted to do, to say there's no difference between a man and a machine, or a man and an animal, or a sane man and an idiot, but to say that these differences are wrongly described when they're described as the difference between a being with, so to speak, a special grotto inside him and a being without that grotto. So I wanted to speak to use a modern idiom, a modern philosophical idiom, to translate out of the, seemed to me, nonsensical terminology of what a man's mental insides and his physical outsides, while preserving the difference between a person with a developed mind and a person with an undeveloped mind, or an animal without a mind and a machine without a mind, and so on. Let's take one case where the word tell would be quite at home. Let's suppose that I'm feeling out of sorts in some way, or maybe even got a pain. I'm tired of pain as a philosopher's example. Anyhow, I go around to the doctor, and he asks me what's wrong, and I tell him what's wrong. Now, it would be, in most cases, perfectly all right to say that I am complaining of such and such discomforts or troubles, and complain might be quite the right word, because let's suppose he makes a note on a piece of paper of all the things I tell him, but I'm still rather bothered, and I go through the whole story again. Not because he needs the information, but because I want to get my complaint off my chest. Well, here you see, complaining is telling, in the sense that all the information that he needs, I hope, is coming out from me, but it isn't just coming out in a merely informative way. It's coming out in a complainer's way. And whereas in a lot of cases you might very well be able to tell a doctor that Ryle was in such and such a condition, what you couldn't do is you couldn't do my complaining for me.
No, that's perfectly true.
And of course there are lots of other things. You can't do my rejoicing for me. You can't do my you can't feel guilt on my behalf, and so on.
But I still feel some hankering to say that nonetheless, though you can know how things are, that there's something in the very nature of our language which makes it, whether it's a complaint or a statement or what, that makes us somehow, some people better at saying. I mean, it seems to me not merely in fact that I'm a better judge of cleverness than you are, because I don't suppose I am, but yet there's some seems that I could, as it were, am in a better position to assess your abilities than you are, just as you're in a better position to assess my vanities than I am. It's not just contingently that you happen to know more about me and therefore can say whether I'm vain or not. There's something more authoritative, I still want to say, in your judgment about my vanity.
Yes.
And I don't think this is a suggestion you see so much of a privacy, because I'm not saying that my vanity is private to you and unknown to me, or unknowable to me, but a kind of who is in a more than contingently better position to say.
Yes.
And I think we are in a better position, as it were, to say, apart from complaining and rejoicing about ourselves in certain ways.
Well, I think you're quite right that this isn't the dismal philosophical question of privacy versus publicity. There need be, there's no reason for bringing in the word privacy, which I think is a bad metaphor anyhow, but there remains the fact that the person who's in the pain or feeling seasick or something of the sort, that he is in a position to tell straight off. And with this there goes, he is the person to complain if there's anything to complain of. And the tone of voice in which he says what he says is part of his saying, just as much as the vocabulary that he uses.
Now, this is quite different, isn't it, what you're now saying, of sort of about the relation between mind and body, shall we put it that way, from the sort of thing which has got popular recently about saying that so to speak, that mental states are identical with brain states and things like that.
Yes. Take first of all the phrase, which is now a jargon phrase, empirical identity. There are plenty of cases where we want to say that so-and-so is one and the same person, for example, as so-and-so. For example, the village squire is one and the same person as the captain of the village cricket team. Or, to take a philosophically notorious example, the evening star is one and the same planet as the morning star. And this is a thing which wasn't known at the time of Plato, or anyhow it wasn't known by Plato. He thought the evening star was one planet and the morning star was another planet. And the astronomers had to discover, by astronomical methods, that as a matter of fact they're one and the same planet. And there are heaps of cases where we want to say that so-and-so and such are one and the same person, or one and the same planet, or one and the same battle, or whatever it may be. And this Australian school that I'm talking about wants to say that, for example, a sensation, or let's say a feeling of surprise, is one and the same with a state of that person's brain. If you ask one and the same what, then they have to bring in some rather general word like event or process or state or something of the sort. You remember Alice got into a confusion about same person. She starts off somewhere in Alice in Wonderland by saying that when she woke up that morning she felt a little bit different. And then a little while later on she's beginning to wonder whether she is the same person, indeed, if not who she is.
Who are you?
I hardly know, sir, at present. At least, I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have been changed several times since then.
What do you mean by that? Explain yourself.
I can't explain myself, I'm afraid, sir, because I'm not myself, you see.
I don't see.
I'm afraid I can't put it more clearly, for I can't understand it myself.
I think you've been doing quite a lot of work recently on the notion of thinking, have you not, if I understand rightly? Well, now, that would seem to be a particularly difficult example from traditional point of view, where one wants to say is, but surely here we got something private. I mean, I can see you frowning, I can hear you talking, I can see you writing and tearing up the bits of paper and so on, but surely it might be said the actual thinking will have to go on, as it were, we say in your head, but at least out of any possibility of my being aware of your thinking.
There is indeed a way in which we use the verb to think in contrast with, for example, say aloud. And this often happens when you're talking to children. Maybe you want them, maybe you've got a guessing game, and you say that the child is to guess the number of so-and-so, but you don't want the child to come out with this number, so you say, don't say it, just think it. And this means keep it to yourself until the right stage of the game has come for revealing it. And I think this is quite common, and here the verb to think certainly does carry with it the notion of keep it to yourself, don't blurt it out. But there certainly are a number of important and difficult problems about what a person is doing who is pondering or deliberating or reflecting, which have nothing much to do with this little matter of whether he blurts it out or keeps it to himself. And one way into the question would be this. You said perfectly rightly that if a person is thinking, then somebody else can't see or hear the thinking that he's doing in the way in which he may hear what the person is saying if he's saying anything, or can see what he's written if he's written something. Sometimes you want to say that what a person is doing is nothing but so-and-so, for example, nothing but clearing his throat. But this might not be the true account, because he might be trying to warn somebody by giving a bit of a cough, and then it wouldn't be true that he's doing nothing but clearing his throat. And this, of course, makes it tempting to say that he's doing something else besides clearing his throat, to answer to the description of warning his companion of something or other. Well, you see, I want to say that the description of me thinking aloud, simply as uttering such and such words in your hearing, this would be saying that thinking is nothing but uttering these words, and that would be quite wrong.
And yet you don't want to say there's something extra that you're doing hidden from me as well.
I want to argue that just as a person who is warning by coughing isn't doing two things, either of which he might do without the other, but that he is warning by coughing. So, in our new case, I want to argue that a person who is thinking something out may indeed be uttering the appropriate words and sentences, maybe geometrical, maybe some other, but he's not both uttering words, i.e. talking, and also thinking. He is thinking, as in the warning case, by uttering words, namely these words, in this order, in this tone of voice, and in this conversational juncture, and so on.
So, well then, would it be correct to say that what makes it thinking is that there is some problem and something which could count as success in the activity?
Although all the most interesting and important sorts or brands of thinking are indeed attempts to solve problems, I do want to keep a niche for thinkings which can't be really described as trying to solve a problem. I want to see what you think about these.
In some cases of what we might sometimes call thinking would have a very superficial resemblance indeed to the sort of thing that you're really interested in.
When we say that man is a rational being, the first thing we want is that he should be able, and sometimes inclined, to set himself for the solution of a problem when that solution still escapes him. And this is what I would like to be able to describe. After that, I would find it fairly easy to go on to say what he's doing when he's trying to persuade you of the iniquity of joining the common market or something like that.
I think that the discussion up to now has given a rather misleading impression about Oxford philosophy, or at least Oxford philosophy in its historic phase of, say, 10 or 20 years ago, namely that it was done, as it were, within the walls of the University of Oxford, and nothing from outside ever penetrated those walls, and that hardly anything ever went from Oxford to the outside world.
But I don't want to interrupt, but it does seem to me that maybe it wasn't insular in the sense of being restricted geographically to the people within the Thames Valley, but nonetheless communication was directed more to people that were sympathetic to the general trends of thought. I mean, it's only been in the last sort of 24 months that serious interchanges have taken place between Oxford and continental universities.
Perhaps I can ask a question here. Yesterday afternoon I was talking to Stuart Hampshire, and he said, talking about Austin, that he thought that Austin really had the idea that it was important to clear one's mind about all kinds of matters, not by trying to construct any big philosophical systems, which he didn't believe was possible, but simply in order to be better equipped for everyday life, for social matters and so on. Do you not feel this?
I believe, that's in a way a bit of rubbish myself. I mean, it's like this. Supposing you learn a bit of elementary logic. Well, now, it may well be true that so doing will help you to avoid a fallacious argument occasionally. But to regard that as a reason for studying formal logic will be quite ridiculous. It simply is. It does have a spill-off. Now, I think once again, if you study moral philosophy, undoubtedly in the course of doing the moral philosophy, you may in fact get yourself a bit clearer about some pressing moral problems of importance. But I mean, the idea that the best way of getting clear on practical issues, what would be to study moral philosophy would be absurd. The best way, if you're going to argue in that point of view, you might say is this, is you're either going to have philosophers or you're going to have witch doctors and soothsayers and astrologers and alchemists. At least we do try and talk rationally about these sort of things, and if we didn't talk about them rationally, maybe some other devils worse than ourselves would come in and discuss them irrationally.
One might think that Ryle's concept of mind was once accepted like a testament brought down from Mount Sinai, but that was hardly the case, was it? I mean, even Austin himself, of course, wrote not rather polite, but extremely critical review as soon as the book appeared.
That's true, but I'm trying to think that also Ryle's influence was due in part to the fact that the time was right for such a view to be widely accepted.
The reason that they have directed this activity in certain areas is that it needs a sociological explanation, but there doesn't seem to be that there's anything in the method of analytical philosophy that precludes its moving into more interesting areas. I mean, why can't an analytical philosopher apply his techniques to concepts like love, which when analyzed might make a difference to people's lives? That is, he isn't sort of just reflecting on concepts and it really doesn't make a difference to how we live ordinarily. Here I have concepts, he tells me what their structure is, and maybe when I see that structure, I'll say, good heavens, I'm organizing my life around and through that concept, say a concept of love, and I ought to change that. I don't like that.
So are you saying that the idea that philosophy is somehow a second-order study is itself a perfectly good one, but the trouble is that Oxford philosophers, as it happens, have been concerned merely to analyse the way we do think without suggesting revision?
Professor Ryle, isn't it possible that one difference between philosophy and other subjects is that it's conceivable that you could actually become a better person by reflecting on the nature of morality, whereas it's hardly conceivable that you could become a better person by, say, theorizing about the chemical constitution of stars?
Maybe I'm a bit nervous about saying yes to this because it would sound like boasting, because having been at it myself for 50 or 60 years, of course I ought now to be a sort of saint, which I don't think I am, or am anxious to be. Anyhow, to get the issue with an edge to it, I'm going to say I see no reason to suppose that studying philosophy seriously is likely to make any bigger difference to the quality of a person's character than studying any other subject seriously. I think studying any subject seriously has a good effect.
I think when people got the other idea, it's things working the other way around. You see, I mean, if you take people like, the famous 19th century moral philosophers, they tended to be rather conscientious men, like John Stuart Mill and so on. But, I mean, in matter of fact, they weren't made conscientious men by studying utilitarian morality as opposed to, shall we say, logic. No. But it simply were that conscientious men tended to be interested in these problems.
Yes, and in many cases it was because they were philosophically inclined, because they'd lost any religious or theological beliefs, but they were the sort of people who would have taken religion very seriously if they kept those beliefs. So to speak, they were morally high-grade people who'd lost their faiths, and that was what made them earnest philosophers in many cases.
You don't think that it's possible, say in the case of Mill, there are one or two of his writings which have now come back into circulation, for example his writing about the treatment of women, that possibly being a philosopher and pursuing the kind of studies he did enabled him to think more clearly and to see more clearly what the issues were?
Oh yes, the Bentham and the Benthamists, they were reformers in intention and wish, as well as being philosophers. And when the question is a big policy of reform, of course, philosophical clear-headedness is a help and not a hindrance.
That's true, and I suppose another thing is that I think on the whole, philosophers are temperamentally people who are less afraid of saying things which are unpopular or odd or ridiculous. I mean, we're always saying things which anybody who was not interested or acquainted with philosophy would think quite ridiculous.
Yes.
Or raising problems that they would think quite ridiculous. And I should have thought that it was not so much a result of doing philosophy, but part of the temperament which made Miller philosopher was also reflected in his willingness to express big, unpopular reforming opinions without trying to cover them up.
What I'm trying to get at is what do you think, say, the student coming to philosophy may reasonably expect of his doing philosophy in terms of other kinds of problems which he's worried about? I'm thinking of a remark of Stanley Cavell's, saying that the issues which one gets involved in when one has been doing philosophy for some time are very often, of course, not the issues which brought one to philosophy in the first place.
Certainly.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, for example, are you interested in teaching your pupils only to do what they're doing, the philosophy that you're teaching them, well, or do you think that you can have some other kind of influence on them? Would you hope to have some other kind of influence on them?
Well, of course, any teacher, particularly if he's doing tutorial teaching, as distinct from only lecturing teaching, acquires something of an avuncular attitude towards his pupils. Oh, and he's very grieved if they break their legs, and not for philosophical or chemical reasons. But I don't think that's what you're asking, whether philosophy tutors care about the general welfare, interests, pursuits, etc. of their pupils.
No, I'm asking something else. I'm asking about whether you think philosophy can actually be of benefit in some moral sense.
Well, the answer that you would like me to give is yes, so I'm going to give the answer no.
Well, could you explain why? Could you explain why you think the answer I'd like you to give is yes, and then explain why?
Well, because you really want me. This is to go back to a previous point, which I think Jim answered very well. You really want to say there's no point in studying philosophy unless you can point to some dividends of a non-philosophic sort. Not, of course, cash dividends, but dividends in the way of becoming more virtuous, or becoming more happy, or becoming more inspired to write poems or plays or something of the sort. Well, I don't want to say that the point of studying philosophy is to get dividends.
You immediately put me in mind of Wittgenstein's remark that there's a therapeutic aspect to philosophy. Getting clear about something.
Yes.
Not even in that sense?
Oh, getting clear, certainly.
What's the value of getting clear?
What's the value of getting truth?
Well, you're the philosopher, I'm asking you.
Well, I'm saying the value of getting clear is the same as the value of getting truth, as opposed to remaining in error or darkness.
The getting clear, if you like, getting clear when it's a puzzle, clearly this is, if you like, an aim of philosophy. But the getting clear is the solution of a problem. It is not an external thing, what I would call a dividend, something which comes through the post as an extra. It's you're doing the thing for its own sake. And as wisdom ones, you mentioned wisdom, Wittgenstein saying the aim is to get clear. Well, of course, wisdom once pointed out that if you wanted to stop being philosophically puzzled, there was always the possibility of taking drugs. That if you took sufficient drugs, you would cease being philosophically puzzled, which, of course, the answer is, but you don't want to stop being puzzled that way. What you want to do is to solve the problems which are before you, for their own sake.
But some of the problems which are before you are problems which relate to the way you relate to the world, as opposed to being, say, purely logical problems. And that presumably the point of solving those is in order to be able to relate to the world better.
Well, but Nelson, you see, supposing, let's take two very extreme and both probably rather ridiculous views that have been put forward in philosophy of the morals. Some people have said that when something is good, that this is for it to have something which is called a non-natural property. That is to say, it has some feature which you discern with the moral eye or some other inward eye, with a kind of invisible paint, if you like, and this is what it is for something to be good. Other people have said that to say that something is good is rather like saying hurrah for it. It's to give vent to your emotions. to cheer, or something like that, nothing more intellectual than that. Very well, but what does this make practically? I mean, in other words, you find some people who say that something good is merely to vent their emotions, nonetheless engage in serious moral crusades, and you find some people who say that goodness is a non-natural quality, engaged in moral crusades. You find some people who hold these two views who are morally very ordinary, slack, not too conscientious individuals too. I don't think that the kind of inquiries that one traditionally, and not merely in modern Oxford, has done in moral philosophy, are the sort which do go with it. If one gets the answer, whatever answer one gives, I don't think it affects your moral status in regard to the world.
Professor Ryle, you talked a bit earlier about Mill and made some reflections on his position in society, loss of religion and so forth. Could you perhaps make some similar reflections on your own status? Are you a religious person? If not, why not? How does this relate?
No, totally irreligious. I was brought up in the, I was going to call it the creed of total agnosticism, and have never departed from it since. What's more, this wasn't even a worried or tortured loss of faith, because I never had it. My father had, but he brought us up as agnostics, so the thing has never been a worry or an agony, as it was to people who lost their faith.
Do you think this has in some way affected the kind of philosophical problems which you've come to be concerned with?
Oh, I think so, yes.
Can you think of any type of connection?
Oh, well, I attacked a senior colleague once at some length for defending a highly professional technical argument called the ontological argument for the existence of God, but I don't remember that I was much interested in the question whether there was a God or not. I was interested in the the trickiness of the argument that he, following other precedents, was using. No, I don't think that had much to do with it.
I'm wondering if the fact that you were not at all ever concerned with certain types of moral or spiritual questions, which obviously some people might be concerned with, might help to account for certain qualities, maybe what some people call abstract qualities, in the kinds of problem that you're dealing with.
Oh, I shouldn't have thought there was much connection there. After all, there's no philosopher, even down to the third-rate ones, who isn't concerned with abstract problems. You might define philosophical problems as, in a certain way, abstract problems.
Could you explain that a little bit more?
Well, if you like, take Socrates, who asked such questions and tried to answer them. What is it for a man to be just, or what is it for a man to be pious, or something like that. Now, these are questions about piety, justice, and so on, abstract questions. He wasn't wandering around the world trying to find out how many just men there were in Athens, or how many people there were who pretended to be pious but weren't. And so he was dealing with an abstract or conceptual question and trying to answer it. And if he hadn't been doing that, he wouldn't have been doing philosophy or something else. But of course, Socrates, like anybody else, was interested in a lot of other things as well. I mean, he was interested in his dinner when he was hungry. Doubtless he was interested in the fate of a battle when he was engaged in the battle as a soldier, and so on. And nobody has only one interest.
But you're convinced that in asking what is a just man, he was only asking an abstract question?
Well, anyhow, I say, I have no evidence that he was interested in anything else at that time.